And we're very pleased to welcome back to our studios Paul Martin, the 21st Prime Minister of Canada, Finance Minister from 1993 to 2002, and it's good to have you in that chair again, sir.
Well, it's good to be here.
Well, we've got a lot to talk about here. Technically, I guess our country's been out of recession for a couple of years now, but we are seeing kind of daily, increasingly bad news come out of the United States, and let's start there. What do you see as the specific source of the problem with the American economy today?
Well, before I do it, let me just pick up on something you said. You used the word technically, we may be going back into recession. I think that you're quite right to use the word technically, because I think if you take a look at the revised figures of what happened in 2007, 2008, that was a massive contraction. One can easily argue that we're not out of that downturn, and it's a continuation. But what happened in the United States, I think, simply was, 10 years of buildup of excessively low interest rates, a bubble allowing to burst, and essentially people being allowed to believe that an increase in the net worth of their housing, in fact, compensated for the fact that their incomes weren't going up. And so the whole thing simply came apart. But when you couple that with what happened in Europe, which I believe is much more serious, then I think clearly we have got the makings of a perfect storm. And that's what we're trying to work our way through.
We'll get to the European situation in a second, but the problems that are happening in the United States today, are they distinct and different from that which brought the House of Cards down 3 years ago?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They are well, yes and no. I mean, what brought the House of Cards down, the whole question of Lehman Brothers as an example, yes, the failure of the banks to be responsible, that certainly is a major part of what we're dealing with today. And stem from them. But I think, no, I think that what we're dealing with as well is the fact that the United States has not adjusted as well as it should have to the rising Eastern economies in China and India. We've not recognized that the workplace has changed, and that in fact, that there better training is required, retraining is required, that jobs have changed within the United States. The huge unemployment factor of the 18 to 24-year-olds is an example of what we're dealing, and that was something that was building up long before.
Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent by governments to stimulate the economies. How well has it worked so far?
Well, I think it's worked better than what people think. I think certainly that the infrastructure spending is...
Did I say millions? I meant billions. Yeah. Hundreds of billions if I said millions.
When I became finance minister, I could never talk about anything else but billions. Right. But the fact is that the infrastructure spending, I think, has worked well. I don't think that the retraining has been anywhere near what it should have been. I don't think the reinvestment in education has worked as well as it should have.
Are we limited in the short term to what we can do in this country to fix all of this?
Well, we're not limited nearly as much as those countries who are having to impose austerity, whether they're right to do so or not. I think that this is the time in Canada, as an example, to invest heavily in education. And the reason is pretty simple. The fact is other countries are imposing austerity, their educational institutions are declining as a result. Our education institutions are very good. This is the time to bring the best and the brightest from the rest of the world to prepare us for the kind of competition that we're facing. In terms of infrastructure, let me just make 2 points. It isn't so much stimulus as we need better infrastructure if we're going to be a productive nation. When interest rates are low, when labor is available, that's the time to invest in infrastructure. But I can tell you something else, and this was very clear when we did the infrastructure program at the time we were fighting the deficit 10 years ago, and that is the comeback to governments, provincial governments and the federal government, as a result of increased taxes of the people who are building on infrastructure, the people who are providing it, corporate taxes, is very great. And there's a very good payback coming from that infrastructure.
But the criticism I hear is that, yes, infrastructure for sure, but what we didn't need was more, you've heard this expression, bridges to nowhere in hockey arenas. We needed we needed bullet trains. And we haven't done that. Well, so have we done the wrong things?
Well, absolutely. The infrastructure program that was done was simply, it was a quick response. Some of it was obviously excessively political. No, what we need is the kind of infrastructure that's going to give us better ports, that's going to give us better roads, that's going to give us better transport systems, the kind of infrastructure that is worth borrowing for, because it's going to pay off over a 25 or 30-year period.
Let me talk to you for a second, again, a follow-up on the U.S. economy. We had a guy named Robert Shapiro on the program the other night who was in Bill Clinton's second term, the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce. And he told us that today the single biggest drag on the U.S. economy is still a very sick housing market. And until this bad debt is deleveraged, the American consumer is not going to start spending, which obviously means until that happens, nothing's going to happen. That's his analysis. Do you essentially agree with that?
I agree with a substantial part of it. There is no doubt that they're going to have to deal with all of these homes that people have walked away from, where the people can't stay in. And if you're going to bail out the banks, I think you can take a look at how you going to bail out people who are dealing with these excessively high mortgages. That being said, I think we've also got to recognize the mistake that was made in the United States was to rely totally on housing to give people self-satisfaction, but also totally on housing to create those jobs. And the fact is that that was a misallocation of resources. They in the United States should have been investing in the kinds of things that were going to allow them to compete with the rising, resurgent economies in Asia.
So last Thursday night when Barack Obama gave his speech to the nation, did you hear anything that you thought adequately addressed the housing issue?
Oh, I think, well, no, I was going to say I thought it was a very good speech. I think that the emphasis on education, the emphasis on infrastructure was very well said. But no, he did not deal with the housing crisis the way that he should have. And I think that that was a gap in what he had to say.
Okay, Europe. You mentioned it earlier. We want to take a look at the troubled banks over there, the sovereign debt that they have over there. Economically stable countries, I guess mostly Germany, are extending loans to the sicker countries of Europe to buy time off so they can stave off their defaults. They've been at this for a while. Does it look like it's working?
No, it's not.
Why isn't it working?
Well, because they're not facing up to the fundamental issue. The fundamental issue is that you can't have a common currency. You can't talk about an integrated economic union unless you're prepared to go all the way. I have believed for quite some time that what the Europeans ought to do is to create a pan-European bond. If you meld all of the European economies together, they in fact have a better balance sheet than the United States does. All of Europe together would. But they can't do it because they've all got all these disparate economies, you know, not bound together. But the fundamental issue is that you can't have a pan-European bond unless you're prepared to completely integrate economically. And of course, the Germans, the Dutch, and the Scandinavians, well, certainly the Germans and the Dutch, won't do it.
So does that require a super governmental structure or a super governmental Ministry of Finance for all of the EU to make that happen?
Well, I don't know how you can have a monetary union unless you've got basically a common fiscal policy throughout Europe, and I don't think you can do it in this sort of higgledy-pockledy way that they're doing it in Europe right now. And the idea put forth, in fact, by the French and the Germans that what we'll have is an overriding understanding between us as to how we will work. Well, forget it. They tried that. Didn't work.
When you say they should go all the way, though, a lot of the commentary we hear nowadays is Europe is too integrated, and it's going to start falling apart. If anything, people are going to start leaving the Eurozone. You're saying you've got to go in the exact opposite direction?
Well, what I'm saying is that you can't be neither fish nor fowl. You've got to be one or the other.
Pick a lane.
Pick a lane. Exactly. That's very well said. I'll use that. And
I stole it from Dalton McGuinty. He said it in that chair a few nights ago.
Really well. Okay. Yeah. Well, then maybe he stole it from me, but he did. Actually, he didn't. Good for you. The fact of the matter is, you cannot have an economic union unless the economic union has the tools to make it work. That's why the Canadian Federation works. That's why, under most instances, the United States works.
Who needs to lead that effort?
Oh, I think the strongest countries, Germany and France.
Do they want to do it?
No, they don't. They have a real problem. I think, to be truthful, that the administration does. If you start talking, and I've done it, talked to a number of the senior Germans, the French, they do, but they recognize that it's just not politically saleable at the present time in Germany.
Have you spoken to their officials recently and suggested that this is something they ought to look at?
Well, I was at a very big conference. I spoke at a big conference of economists in Provence, in France, this summer. And there were economists from all over. And I was amazed when I put forth the argument for the European bond and what they were going to have to do. Politically, publicly, they were very skittish. In the private conversations, these are the economists, not the politicians, virtually unanimous support.
Why can't you get there from here?
Because, in fact, you know, the European Union was built on a set of promises. And those promises were not an integrated economic union of the kind that we're talking about. And the populations in places like Germany, like Holland, are just absolutely against it, because what they think is they're just simply going to pick up the pieces for the Greeks or the Portuguese.
Well, I mean, I guess in a sense, you're asking people to double down on this idea. And this idea is under a lot of criticism right now. Is this a bit, politically, is this too much to ask right now of people?
Well, what's the alternative? I mean, the Europeans feel very strongly that they've got to protect the euro, that the Eurozone the Eurozone has to be able to continue. All I'm really saying is if that's what you really want, then this is the penalty that you're going to have to pay, which I don't think is that much of a penalty. I think, in fact, if Europe was to do it, you'd find a resurgent Europe. But they would have to go through, no doubt, the tortures of the damned to get there.
We know that the crisis in Europe right now is a mostly financial crisis, but we also see it leading very much to politics. And I wonder, as you kind of look down the road, I wonder how far and how deeply you see this political crisis going. In other words, could the foundations of the Union itself be in trouble right now?
Well, I think that obviously if you look at most commentators, that's exactly what they're saying.
Do you agree with that, though?
Do I think that oh, sure. I mean, I do not think that they can continue along the lines that they are, which is, as I said earlier, being neither fish nor fowl. I think they're going to have to essentially choose, to use your expression, one path or the other. And eventually that's going to happen. I think that muddling through, which is sometimes not a bad way to operate, is not going to work in this case.
Nouriel Roubini, of course, says it's over. Time to pull it apart. Let's stop wasting time. Is that an option?
Well, it's certainly an option for him and for a number of other people who just think the time has come. I myself think that would be a tragedy, and which is why I would take the opposite course.
Tragedy because?
Oh, because the cost of undoing the euro would be simply staggering in terms of bankruptcy of financial institutions, in terms of countries, people being wiped out, individuals being wiped out. The human costs of undoing what they've had to do would be overwhelming. And anybody who sort of says we can just do this and it's easy, forget it.
Okay, let's, in our final segment here, let me bring you home. And I know you hate my asking these kinds of questions, which is exactly why I'm going to ask it this way. And that is, if you were still living in 24 Sussex, or you were still the finance minister of the country, what might you be doing today to deal with the economic problems that we have that are not happening right now?
Well, I'm not living there, and I'm talking to you, and I'm quite enjoying it. And so, but what I would do, I think, is to take advantage of the fact that we have to deal with our deficit. I mean, we have a structural deficit. We went into deficit before the crisis occurred, and we've got to be able to deal with that. But that being said, we're not in the situation the United States or the Europeans are in. And this is the time to invest in infrastructure, and it is the time to invest in education. Because this is what is going to give us, as a nation of 34 million people, the capacity to trade with massive economies like China, India with 1 billion too.
But that would not lower the deficit.
Well, you're not going to lower the deficit.
In the short run.
You're not going to lower the deficit if, in fact, your economy is stagnating. We got to understand that. And there are things that we can do now that will make our economy a great deal stronger. And the fact is, I believe we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can lower the deficit. We can get our debt to GDP ratio down, and we can invest in the kinds of things that are going to make our economy stronger. I keep going back to this. That what makes a nation strong is the strength of its middle class. We've only got 34 million people to draw on. And we do depend on the rest of the world exporting to them. If we're going to do that, we'd better make sure that we've given ourselves the tools to do so.
I know you thought it was a bad idea, like I think every other economist in the country except for one, and he happens to be Prime Minister, cutting the GST by 2 points. Would you try to restore closer to balance on the balance sheet of the country right now by raising the GST?
The problem with the cutting of the GST was that there was a better alternative. That was cutting personal income taxes. And that's clearly the way that we should have gone. But look, that's water under the bridge now.
So can you raise the GST right now?
Well, those are decisions which a government is going to have to take. I don't think it was the right decision at the time. It put us back, it put us into deficit, took away our margin of maneuver, and took away our ability to lower income taxes, and that was unfortunate.
How much revenue do you suppose the government of Canada has foregone as a result of cutting the GST by 2 points? How long ago is it now? 5 years already?
A great deal. A great deal.
I mean, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars potentially, right?
Well, over time.
Right, over all those years. I want to ask you about a book. I don't know if you read Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt's book, This Time is Different, which shows that economic problems that stem out of financial crises, as opposed to regular recessions, are very long and very deep, and as their title suggests, this time it's different. So generally speaking, are our governments doing the right things to deal with a crisis that this time is different?
Well, I read about half of the book, but then when I did it, even luckier, I got to sit down and talk to Ken Rogoff about it.
Even better.
That was even better. I think their thesis is dead on. In fact, they've proven it. And what they've also proven is that the worst financial crises are ones that stem from the failure of financial institutions. That was, in fact, a very important part of what they had to say. But we in Canada actually have handled that very, very well. We did it when we basically improved bank regulation at a time when other countries were weakening theirs, when New York and London were competing and we didn't. We did it when we did not allow the banks to merge, and our banks are very well managed. So that part of the crises we've taken care of. The Bank of Canada have shown exactly the same thing. Without a doubt, the worst financial crises are those that stem from bank crises because it's a failure of confidence and trust, and the economy depends on confidence.
Where do you think we're on the wrong track in Canada?
Well, I think that we are largely on the right track, except that I don't think that we're investing in the kinds of things that really count. When you said, 5 minutes ago that the infrastructure program that the government put into place, when that infrastructure program, as you said, was, basically fake lakes and this kind of thing, that was a terrible blow at what could have been done to really make the country stronger. And if we're going to do it, the next time it shouldn't be shovel ready. It should be take advantage of this downturn when interest rates are low, when labor is available to rebuild what is a desperate need, and that is the infrastructure of the country. And that goes right across from coast to coast to coast.
An odd political question, just to finish up here. Do people prefer to be prime minister when everything's going to hell, or do people prefer to be prime minister when basically things are good?
Well, I think people prefer to be prime minister when their time has come. And I think under those circumstances, there are going to be problems, and they want to deal with them. But I think ultimately what you want to do is you want to build. You want to build for the future. It's one of the reasons, for instance, when I was prime minister, I got so heavily involved in the healthcare issue, in the Aboriginal issue, and in the cities issue, because this is where you build a country.
Gotcha. Mr. Martin, as always, it's good of you to come into TVO tonight and help us out with this. Thanks so much.
Thank you.